Welcome back, everybody, to more from the Stabilizers. I'm here today with Jordan. How's it going, Jordan?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
That is good, and we're here to take a look at one of the most hyped cards for the Worlds format, that is Reshiram Charizard. We've played this deck already against Blake's Malamar Giratina list. Didn't go quite as planned, but hey, it's still going to be a big force in the upcoming format.
It sure is, and I personally feel like you might have gotten a little unlucky in those games because I've been doing very well with this deck in my testing, and I think it's got a lot of good things about it going forward.
Yes, and I suspect the same. So we'll share the list that we've got. It's not exactly the same as the list against Blake. I've already made a couple of little changes, and that's one thing to remember with these lists is that they're not perfect. This is our first draft. Things will change. Obviously, 2 months until World Championships, so there's plenty of time to make adjustments. But at the moment, we start off with 3 Reshiram Charizard Tag Team GX in a format where very little can do more than 200 damage. Reshiram Charizard doing 230 with Flare Strike and a potential 300 damage with Double Plays GX is a very powerful attacker.
It certainly is, and I actually wonder if 3 copies of this card might be a little high. I think you could very easily get away with only 2 copies, but due to the fact that Fire doesn't have the best access to Pokemon Search right now, 3 is definitely a safe amount to go with, just for prizing purposes, and of course, just having it in your opening hand is pretty good.
Yep, that's 100% required to attack with, and because so many Pokemon are going to struggle to hit this big 270 number, Outrage is also going to be a potentially huge attack in World Championships, to the point where people might not be doing things like attacking with Flare Strike into other Reshiram Charizards for the fear of taking 260 damage in return. But of course, the irony there being that even a fully powered Outrage from a Reshiram Charizard can't even knock out another one. So perhaps maybe not as powerful as I'd originally thought.
Well, it's interesting you say that because one thing that I've noticed that's drastically different between Reshizard now and Reshizard for the Worlds format is that you actually see, or at least I personally have been going for the 6 Angie double plays a lot more often than I used to.
Yeah, it's one of those attacks that at the moment you don't really need to go for. Things like Choice Band mean that you can take knockouts quite quickly, but the double blaze for 300 is going to be very, very relevant come August for World Championships. And if Reshiram Charizard isn't doing enough damage for you, then our list at the moment has 2 copies of Baby Blacephalon. It's actually quite interesting because these 2 Pokemon wouldn't even really be considered in a deck before the rotation, but now they actually work quite well together. Blacephalon with Fireball Circus is able to do big damage, can do 300 damage quite easily in reality, and it also gives away 1 prize whilst Reshizard gives away 3. So they kind of work to each other's benefit, I guess. They're doing the things that each other kind of struggle to do.
Yeah, there's nothing you really can't achieve without either of these cards. Like between Reshizard and Blacephalon, you can pretty much have an ideal attacker for almost every scenario. And you already mentioned that Blacephalon is really strong now, especially since Reshizard's going to be lacking in damage a little bit without Choice Band. That Fireball Circus is going to be a really strong attacker, considering it's the highest damage output in this deck now. And I feel like it's actually a better attacker in Reshizard if you can ever pull it off. If you have the option of choosing which attacker to use, I'd almost always go with Blacephalon. It's just a little harder to pull off. It needs a couple extra cards to pull off the combo. But if you've got the access to those cards, it's such a stronger play.
That's beautifully put, and nice segue as well, because here's how we're going to try and access our cards. We have 4 copies of Jirachi. It's a very thick Jirachi line, but now more than ever it is important that we start with it. Without Pokemon Search like Nest Ball and Ultra Ball, we need to maximize the opportunities that we're going to take to get into Jirachi, because if we start with it, we give ourselves a really good chance to win the game. You'll remember in the first game that I played against Blake, the only reason I didn't get donked in the first game and was able to set up is because Jirachi ended up finding me some cards. But if that had have been another Pokemon, that would never have happened. So Jirachi, very important.
Yeah, it's obviously another card in this list that I would consider. Maybe you could cut down 1 copy of it, go down to 3, but just like with Reshizard, it's obviously a card that you really want to have in your opening hand. And I just wouldn't feel safe cutting down to 3 at this point, at least not with the current build. It's just so important. You almost always want to have one in play if you can afford the bench space. And there's a lot of cards that you want to be able to find in this deck at the right time, and Jirachi helps with that.
Certainly is, and one of those cards that you might be trying to find in the early game is one of your 2/2 Salazzle line. This is our other consistency card. Rather than using Jirachi to Stellar Wish and find item cards, Salazzle is doing what Zoroark used to do: Roast Reveal, discard a Fire Energy, and draw 3 cards. And now Reshizard actually finds itself with really big hands a lot of the time, since you're able to burn through with Heat Factory and Salazzle to find exactly what you need.
It's weird because when Reshizard first came out, I envisioned that the list was going to look kind of like the one we're showing off now, where it was going to be pretty Salazzle focused, but that never ended up being the case. We saw some just straight welder builds and some green builds, but I think Salazzle was now the time to shine, and especially with that baby Blacephalon as an attacker. Without Jirachi and Salazzle, you're never realistically going to be able to pull off Blacephalon to its full potential, but with Jirachi and Salazzle, you can slowly build your hand up to the point where you can potentially just drop down a Blacephalon, weld it to it, and deal like 300 damage out of nowhere.
Yeah, it's a very powerful combination. And the big thing, I think this is the genuine thing that makes this deck a massive threat for Worlds, even if it wasn't already doing 230 to 300 damage. It's the fact that it has Fire Energy, so it can play a 1/1 copy of Ninetales. Ninetales is the best Gust effect that Fire decks have, being able to discard 2 Fire Energy in order to bring up your opponent's benched Pokemon. And when you have cards like Fire Crystal or Big Oven or Giant Sauna or whatever it's called, those energy cards aren't actually hard to find. You can bring up pretty much anything on the bench and take an easy knockout or even win the game.
I would actually argue that Ninetales not only is the best Gust effect the Fire decks have, but probably the best Gust effect in the format. And I would even go as far as to say that this Reshizard with Salazzle build is the deck that abuses Ninetales better than any other deck. So you can fairly safely say this is a deck that has the best Gust in the format, because with the Jirachi and Salazzle build, you're able to just draw so many cards, you have so much access to the Fire Energy that you're recycling over and over again, and it makes it really easy to find these turns where you can just consecutively pull off Ninetales turn after turn and bring up exactly what you need to knock out, which is it's such an insane advantage to have in this format.
Yeah, it's a really big deal. One of the problems that the list has is sometimes you'll find yourself, because you don't have that much ball search to find Pokemon, trying to choose between, do I go for a Salandit, do I go for a Vulpix? That's why we play 1 copy of Ditto Prism. That way, if we are in that position where we need to choose, maybe we're going for a Dedenne or a Lily to draw more cards, we can find ourselves a Ditto. It can be either. Usually you want it to be a Salandit, but it means that something like a Spell Tag knocking out a Vulpix isn't such a big deal.
Yep, it's definitely a standing inclusion in any deck that's playing more than one Stage 1, and this is no exception to that rule, where Ditto is just a very powerful card for giving you a couple extra options and making potential prize cards less punishing.
Yes, 100% certainly is. That is the truth, etc. All the affirmatives. The next card that we have kind of in our little text slot is 1 copy of Bench Barrier Mew, obviously expecting Pikachu Zekrom to be one of, if not the deck to beat at World Championships, and Mew is such a good card at beating it. Not only does it stop the Tag Bolt taking a knockout on one of your benched Pokemon, but it actually does something really cool that it's been able to do for a long time, but because Choice Band exists, Reshizard hasn't needed it. What you can do is you can actually attack into 2 Pikachu Zekrom with a Flare Strike, hitting 230, and then you can set up yourself for a Psi Power for game, just to put those extra damage counters on to take 6 prizes in a turn. Even if you're only knocking out 1 Pikachu Zekrom, that's a real positive, and you can potentially set yourself up to take your last couple of prizes with Blacephalon. A very powerful counter to that deck specifically, but a bit of a utility as well.
It's such a versatile attack, that Psi Power. The more I play this game, the more I fall in love with how good this attack is, and how often I'm using it is increased daily, but its obviously main use is to swing that Pikachu Zekrom matchup, but you know, there's always some other snipe cards in the format. There's potentially stuff like Dugong running around. I'm not sure how much play Dugong we'll see in the Worlds format, but potentially Dugong and Malamar could be something that Reshizard finds annoying, and Malamar's going to help keep that Dugong at least a little bit in check.
Yeah, that's true. That Mew will be able to stop those 60 snipes. Won't be able to deal with the attack on the active, though. Our final card, our only other GX, is a Dedenne. Just the one copy of this one. You only really want to play one down. You can't fill your bench up with these things. But Dedenne Change is an excellent ability that we are going to try and abuse in the early game to try and set up our board state. Those first couple of turns are really, really critical, and so Dedenne is going to try and help us get there.
Dedenne actually feels kind of awkward in this deck for me. I mean, like, obviously, it's great when you've got those hands where you're missing a Welder or you're missing a Lily and you just want to turn one Dedenne. But assuming things are actually going well for this deck, I very rarely find myself ever wanting to use Dedenne, just because assuming things are going well, your hand just grows in size every turn. You never want to throw away your resources. But what Dedenne is good for is if you don't have to use it in the early game, it's a really good out for if you ever get hit by a late game reset stamp. Just being able to draw into Dedenne or Bull Search for Dedenne will really help you recover from a late game reset stamp.
It certainly will. So the deck has options to take knockouts. It can do all sorts of stuff, which is good fun. And hey, you're gonna be doing lots of damage even if you're not taking knockouts, which is the key. We'll have a look at the support line very quickly, and because there's no Guzma and lots of those kind of cards missing from the format, this is kind of a weird supporter line. We actually have 4 copies of Lily, obviously excellent in the early game. We've got 4 copies of Welder in order to attach a whole bunch of energy, and 1 copy of Brock's Grit, try and shuffle some of our resources back in the late game. It's actually the only way that we have to return Pokemon and energy to the deck once they've been discarded, apart from obviously Fire Crystal.
Yeah, it's definitely weird seeing a support line like this, but as I was just saying before, this deck, if it's working properly, gets to 10, 15 cards plus very quickly, so all of a sudden cards like Erica or Cynthia don't really seem that strong. I'd rather just hold onto my hand and just keep making it bigger and bigger with Welder and Salazzle. Lily obviously a super important card for the early game, but even then, once you've got yourself a big hand, you're not really looking to use draw supporters too often, so we really want to be looking more at those tech supporters like the Welder and the Brock. And now that we've lost Guzma, there's not really that many tech supporters to choose from, so for the time being, we're keeping it fairly straightforward.
Yeah, there are obviously some other techs that you could consider putting in there because, hey, there's going to be turns when you've played your Welder, you can't play Lily, and you may as well use a supporter of some description, but at the moment, there's nothing that we're really screaming out for, so in our testing, we've just gone for the most basic supporter line possible. Now onto the items. This is where things start to really drastically change from our current lists. Normally we'd start off with 4 Ultra Ball, but instead we have to start off with the new best Pokemon search in the format, and that is Pokemon Communication. Obviously we've got a lot of Pokemon in our deck, and we're going to want to find some of them to be able to shuffle them back in and find the exact cards we need. So that's probably going to be the number one way we're going for things like Salandit, Salazzle, or even our Ninetales in the late game.
And the playset of Pokemon Communication is part of the reason why a lot of the Pokemon counts in this deck are slightly thicker than you would expect, such as the Jirachi and the Reshiram. You could easily get away with 1 less copy of each of those, but keeping those counts high not only just helps you with finding them early, but it just really helps in the late game as well, just using communication to help increase your board state overall.
Yep, it is, and one of the cards that I didn't actually play against Blake, but I have put in the meantime, is 2 copies of Cherish Ball. Initially, when we were looking at the list, we were kind of like, oh, well, you probably don't even really need it. I mean, you're just going to draw into lots of cards anyway, but one of the problems that I was finding, especially in those games against Blake, was that I either had hands where I had Pokemon but no Pokemon Communication, or I had Pokemon Communication and I didn't have Pokemon. And the thing with Cherish Ball is, even if you do have a Reshiram in play, or even if you're looking for like a Dedenne or something like that, it might be useful to find them, but you can Stellar Wish with Jirachi, find your Cherish Ball, search for a GX, and then shuffle it back in with Pokecoms to get the card that you want. So it's got a little bit more utility than just finding one of the 4 GX Pokemon that we play.
Yeah, it's mainly just a small consistency booster. It's not strictly an amazing card in this deck, and a lot of the time it is just going to seem like a dead card, but in the times that you do need it, it's really important, especially in our testing. It has had a little bit of slow starts every now and again, and for the most part from my testing today, I was finding that Cherish Ball was kind of making those bad hands pretty rare.
Yeah, it at least gives you something to search for. I know times against Blake where I had like bonkers welder hands where I could do 1 billion damage, but I just didn't have an attacker. And similarly, I had turns where I had lots of attackers but no way to get into energy. So hopefully Cherish Ball can help us kind of thin out those poor cards and get our starts a little bit better. Onto some of our other items. We have 4 copies of Fire Crystal. This is our main energy recursion. Obviously, Brock is an option, but Fire Crystal is going to be one of the cards that we are going to try and play most of the time. Obviously, we're going to be burning energy with Salazzle, with Heat Factory, with Ninetales. We're going to be throwing energy away with Blacephalon. We're going to be attaching a ton of energy to Reshizard, so we need to be able to get those energy back. And Fire Crystal, being able to find 3, is actually very, very powerful.
It's pretty crazy in this deck. Like, when I play this deck, it definitely seems like by far the most important card in the list, and pretty much for the entire game, I'm basing my resources on how many Fire Crystals I have left. All of my plays are based on my Fire Crystal count, because I'm thinking, can I afford to Heat Factory this away? Can I afford to play this Welder, or can I afford to use this Ninetales based on how many Fire Crystals I have left? Because it's just such a huge card. For people who have been playing long enough, it feels just as important as Superior Energy Retrieval did back in the day in Blastoise decks, where the whole entire game would just be trying to keep count of how many Superior Energy Retrieval you have left, because every time you play one, it's a huge swing in the game.
Yeah, and we've lost access as well to regular energy retrieval, so Fire Crystal is our best bet from there. You could look for things like Energy Recycle System if you're looking for more energy recursion, but we figure that with 12 energy in the deck and access to return 12 of them to our hand, 24 energy seems pretty good. If you can't win with that many, then you're probably going to struggle.
And hey, you've also got Brock if you're desperate as well.
Yeah, if things get really hairy, you can chuck those back in. Onto the rest of our items, we have 3 copies of Switch and also 3 copies of a skateboard. We're playing a Jirachi engine, even though we've got lots of other exciting stuff to play with. Jirachi is still going to be our main kind of support in the early to mid game, and we need to be able to move in between them quite comfortably. Also, Flare Strike is obviously unable to be used once you've used it once, so we need to switch from those Reshizards into something with an escape board in order to start attacking again. And now that Guzma doesn't exist, it's actually an incredibly valuable resource.
Yeah, the way I look at it is the more Jirachis I'm playing, the more cards that I want to have to interact with Jirachis, the more times I'm going to be able to use Stellar Wish, especially in this deck, the better, because it is a deck that's really going to be relying on building up a strong hand and then making the power play turns when you've finally found the right combination of cards. And as you mentioned, like, just switching in general is pretty important in this format, especially when you've got big retreat Reshizards that you want to keep the energy on, but often need to get out of the way after they've used a Flare Strike.
Well, hey, it's not the end of the world. I guess one of the cool things about Reshiram Charizard is that its retreat cost is actually 3 energy, so you can just retreat a Reshizard, get all those energy back with Fire Crystal, and then use a switch to get back into it after you've welded, or even start attacking with Blacephalon. So it's not the end of the world, but obviously that is quite an expensive way to attack. We'd rather keep it as simple as possible. We've got 5 more items, or 2 more items and 3 stadiums actually. One little bonus card that we get from this set is Reset Stamp. Obviously there's going to be lots of decks that are going to try and take quick prizes against us, and Reshiram Charizard giving away 3 prizes means that even if our opponent has only taken 1 knockout, then Reset Stamp is potentially a game-winning card.
I find myself wanting to have at least 2 Reset Stamp in every deck, especially the decks that are playing Tag Team Pokemon, because if your opponent ever knocks out a Tag Team Pokemon, it means they're probably in a pretty good position. They've probably got a lot going for them in terms of momentum in the game, and they've just added 3 extra cards to their hand, so it's almost always crucial to find a Reset Stamp on the turn that a Reshizard goes down. And with all of the draw power and the Jirachi search power we've got, it's not too hard to find Reset Stamps when you need them, and just as importantly, it's also pretty easy to avoid discarding them, considering you're not going to be losing your hand too much. When you draw one in the early game, you can typically just hold on to it until your opponent eventually takes enough prizes for it to be devastating for you.
Yeah, and if you've put yourself in a position where maybe they've knocked out a Reshizard and they're only being able to take 1 prize knockouts on Blacephalon, then Reset Stamp can be even more powerful. Reset Stamping your opponent to 1 and then taking a big knockout can almost very easily just end the game. So that's what we'll be looking to do with them, but hey, even the ability to just play a card out of your hand in order to draw into some final resources with Lily is not bad either. Another way that we can remove bad cards from our hand if we need to is through Giant Furnace, or Big Oven, or Large Sauna, or Better Viridian, as we've been calling it.
Broken Viridian.
Broken Viridian, Better Viridian. It's an excellent card where we can discard a card from our hand and search for 2 fire energy. And the best thing about this card is that it doesn't actually apply for both players in every matchup. So if they're not playing fire energy, then they cannot search for energy. Unlike Viridian, where if my opponent plays it down, I can still use it to find one. If I'm playing against Giratina Malamar, for example, hey, they can discard a card, but they're sure as hell not going to find any energy off of it.
Yeah, I love that combination of your opponent puts down a Viridian, you use it to find 1 fire energy, and then you replace it with a Giant Furnace and find yourself another 2 energy. And not only is energy just a really reliable, a really important resource to have in your hand in this deck, but when I have this stadium in play, it often encourages me to go for that more risky Baby Blacephalon route, because I find it a lot easier to pull off the attack when I'm basically guaranteed to have 100 damage in my hand just because of the stadium staying in play.
It's actually really cool with a Fire Crystal and a Giant Furnace. Just 2 cards, that's 250 damage. That's knocking out almost every attacker in the format. So all you need to do is just have a Baby Blacephalon with 3 energy on it, those 2 cards in hand, and suddenly you've got yourself a massive, massive turn. And unless you're playing Reshiram Charizard, you're probably going to be taking prizes.
That's certainly true, especially since there's not really anything that can stop an attack from Blacephalon, and Reshiram is going to be going through all effects on your opponent's Pokemon, so as long as you've got the damage output you need, you're almost always going to be taking prizes.
Certainly will. Our final trainer is 1 copy of Heat Factory. No matter how broken Viridian is, Heat Factory is even more broken. Being able to discard a fire energy to draw 3 cards is an excellent effect, and piling that on top of maybe a Salazzle or 2 means that you're going to be able to get a ton of extra resources in hand, maybe even a Fire Crystal to bring those energy back to attach or discard with Blacephalon in order to take a big knockout. Heat Factory, very powerful.
Yeah, between Heat Factory, Salazzle, and Welder, we have potential to turn our fire energy into 3 extra cards, up to 4 times a turn if we have all of those resources accessible. We can use Heat Factory, double Roast Reveal, and of course a Welder to draw 12 additional cards to our hand and play a lot of energy onto the board. And that's really all you want to be doing with this deck, is attaching energy and drawing cards.
Yep, and speaking of energy, we have 4, 8, 12 fire energy with which to attack and draw cards. 12 seems like a pretty optimal number. It's not like Blacephalon where we have to put them in the lost zone, so we can afford to keep them and get them back. We don't need to play 15, which is a preposterous amount, but 12 seems like the right number just for now.
If I were to add any more energy, I would honestly just rather add more cards that get energy back from the discard pile, because there's already enough ways of drawing into energy from our deck. The only risky part is running out of energy, so I wouldn't be too worried about running out of energy, just more so worried about not being able to get them back.
Yeah, exactly. So there you go. That's the list that we've been running with. It's a pretty solid effort. I'm just going to try and center them in the screen there. There's our 3 main little boys. Obviously, again, it's our first draft of the list, so things will probably change. And well, they'll definitely change. This is not the list that we're going to take to Worlds by any stretch. But hey, it's a decent starting point. Thanks, Jordan, for sharing that one with us.
No problem.
And thanks everyone for watching. If you enjoy the content, then please consider subscribing by clicking the Sableye in the middle of the screen. On the left-hand side are some videos that YouTube thinks that you'll like, and on the right is our Worlds format playlist, where you can see more of this kind of content from us here at the Sableyes. Thanks everyone for coming along, and we'll see you all next time for more. Bye.